moved the Indians anyway, including the other tribes, 4 tribes that were still in the southeast that I named already, and by foot they walked to what is now present-day Oklahoma, the state of Oklahoma, where they still live today. This is considered by many to be an act of genocide since such a large number of Indians died on the journey. And here's a map of the Trail of Tears, as it's called. Here we have the Seminole Indians in Florida. Here's Alabama right here. Choctaw Indians, Chickasaw, Cherokee, and Creek. And then Oklahoma, several hundred kilometers in that direction. We continue the happy story of Alabama and slavery. Because it was generally, the economy of Alabama was, and the whole South, was agrarian. Farming was basically the way to make money, and slavery was the primary method by which landowners effectively grew their crops. In 1860, at the beginning of the Civil War, half of Alabamians, or half of the people in the state of Alabama were slaves, and about 35% of families in Alabama owned slaves. The Republican Party, which was a relatively new party at the time, had a stance of anti-slavery, and when the first Republican president, Abraham Lincoln, was elected, several southern states seceded from the Union, formed a new country called the Confederate States of America, effectively beginning the Civil War. Alabama seceded from the Union in 1861. During the several years that the war lasted, 120,000 Alabamians fought in the war. Oftentimes, slaves would fight alongside their masters. There were very few major battles in the state before the end of the war, however. And of course, slavery was officially ended in 1865. And as many people had predicted, the war itself and its aftermath, the end of slavery, and the North's approach to reconstruction of the South, destroyed the Southern economy. Now, when slaves were freed in 1865, what we had basically were a very, very, very large minority of new Americans, legally speaking, who now had to participate by earning a living, by paying rent, by saving money, even some simple things such as bathing and brushing your teeth were things that many of these people did not know. And a gentleman who was born a slave in the state of Virginia, he was 9 years old in 1865, and so he spent a large part of his childhood as a slave, by the name of Booker T. Washington, moved to the state of Alabama and opened the Tuskegee Institute in Tuskegee, Alabama, now known as Tuskegee University. And it was designed basically to teach basic life skills to newly freed slaves. Of course, this wasn't the only institution. The federal government had its own, certainly its own programs in the Freedmen's Bureau. But this was something specifically in the state of Alabama, and it was operated and completely managed by black Alabamians, black Americans. In the community, of course, it was roundly supported, and many Alabamians, most Alabamians, are actually quite proud of the Tuskegee University right now with 34 bachelor's degrees and 12 master's programs. I have here a picture of the classroom taken about around the turn of the century. And here's a portrait of Booker T. Washington. He wrote a book called Up From Slavery. It's very short. It's a pleasure to read. It is about his life and the founding and managing of the Tuskegee Institute. Because it was published 100 years ago, it is public domain, so you can find it on the internet. So it's something that would be quite interesting for as part of an American Studies course if you're curious. Into the 20th century, racism was, and unfortunately still is, a way of life in Alabama. But legally, you had what was called separate but equal, which meant that private companies, private businesses, and the government could separate the races, could keep whites in one place and blacks in another place. This went as far as schools, laundromats, water fountains, restaurants, buses, public restrooms. In addition, there were things such as poll taxes and literacy tests, which were designed to suppress the black vote. I'm sure you know that the power of the ballot is one of the single greatest powers that an individual can hold, and white Southerners did everything they could to suppress blacks, to keep blacks from voting. So such things as having a tax, so to vote you have to pay. Or to vote you have to prove that you can read. In addition, the Ku Klux Klan, which is fortunately not from Alabama, it is Tennessee, but it was quite popular in the state of Alabama, were very violent against blacks, particularly those who were doing such things as trying to vote, committed numerous acts of violence, bombings, oftentimes churches, lynchings, where black Alabamians were murdered, lynched, and very often then set on fire. And the perpetrators were rarely prosecuted. Here's a picture from Life magazine of business in the time of Jim Crow, or the separate but equal laws, where non-whites had to have a different waiting room. Here's a separate white and black water fountain. In 1963, school segregation was ended, although it moved rather slowly after that. And military had to be used to force schools in Alabama and other parts of the South to comply with the new law. Then in 1964, separate but equal, the law that made it so that states could keep the races separate, became illegal with the signing of the Civil Rights Act in 1964. But there were still voting rights issues, unfortunately, at that point. But a lot of this was the result, and was happening at the same time, as the Civil Rights Movement, which started in Alabama with the Montgomery bus boycott of 1955. And in addition to that, and we're going to talk about that in more detail, there were things such as sit-ins where mixed race groups or black only groups would come to a restaurant that was for whites only and just sit down at the restaurant and refuse to get up. Freedom rides, which were challenging a recent court ruling that said interstate travel could not be segregated, and so you could get on a bus in another state as a mixed group and come into a segregated state legally. And I'll talk more about that in a moment, actually. And things such as marches and rallies, and then some of the Montgomery marches for voting rights, which I'll talk about more also. So the bus boycott. In the city of Montgomery, which is the capital, you recall, buses were private and segregated. Basically what happened was whites sat in the front of the bus and blacks sat in the back of the bus. And at any point, let's say, for example, if a white patron got on and there were no seats, the blacks all had to stand up and move back so that the white could then sit down. Very often even, a black bus rider would have to get on at the front, pay, and then get off, and then get back on in the back. But a woman by the name of Rosa Parks, a seamstress, one day refused to give up her seat to a white man. And in fact, this is not the first time that something like this happened. One time, actually 10 years before this, she got on a bus and she paid, and as she got off to walk to the back, the bus driver left. But she remembered who the bus driver was. Then, 10 years later, she got on this bus, and she saw that it was the same bus driver. And when he asked her to get up and give up her seat, she said no. Started the Civil Rights Movement as a result. She was arrested. The event started a citywide boycott. The whole nation was watching, and eventually courts integrated Montgomery buses in 1956. One thing that's important, though, is that in Montgomery at the time happened to be Martin Luther King, who basically started his his career in the civil rights movement with this event. Then there were the Selma to Montgomery marches for voting rights. Even though the Civil Rights Act had been signed in 1964, blacks did not have equal voting rights. There were still things like poll taxes and literacy tests. And so there were 3 marches that took place between the city of Selma and the city of Montgomery. It was about, I have the distance, 82 kilometers. Depending on which march, sometimes several hundred people, sometimes up to 25,000 people. People in the march were frequently attacked. They were beaten by police. They were attacked with tear gas. They were completely peaceful. They were not instigating at all. But it is also considered a turning point in the civil rights movement, and almost single-handedly led to the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that, of course, made discrimination in the polls illegal. Here is a photograph, famous photograph by James Corrales of one of the marches. Unfortunately, you can't see it very well. Then Freedom Riders. So like I said, activists would board buses coming from out of state, which was considered legal. But the buses were attacked, buses were bombed, riders were taken out of the bus and beaten to within inches of their lives. Ambulances would refuse to take wounded to hospital. This happened in Alabama as well as other places. And eventually, the military had to be used to protect the riders. You can't really see. This is a minister from Wisconsin by the name of Jim Zwerg, and he was one of the Freedom Riders. You can't really see. This was taken out of the hospital. He's badly beaten. Here are some Freedom Riders, also from Life magazine, riding with military escort. Quite brave individuals. Here is a peace rally. Oftentimes the police would use dogs against the marchers. Into the 21st century, we're still poor, and a lot of us are still racist, but we're working hard. I myself am a product of the Alabama school system, and I'm not a racist. Right? And so most Alabamians are like me. We're not all like them, fortunately. State politics has corruption problems, but the economy is somewhat a little bit more resilient now. It's not just farming. And you know, if your economy is based on one thing, like farming or like gas or oil or something, and that one thing, you know, hits a stumbling block, then your entire economy suffers as a result. But so in addition to farming, there's higher education, aerospace, industry. There are actually cars manufactured in the state of Alabama, 28 universities, and the space shuttle was designed in North Alabama. So here's some famous Alabamians. George Wallace, considered the most famous loser in American politics. He lost far more than he won, but he did serve as a governor 4 times. He was a segregationist. He was opposed to integration of schools in the state. He was running for president in 1972 and was shot and paralyzed. In the 1980s, he did come around and apologize for his early transgressions. But he is remembered, really nationwide, for one thing, and that is to stand in the schoolhouse door at the University of Alabama in 1963. This is my university. When he was running for governor the year before, he promised Alabamians that if they try to allow blacks to enroll in an Alabama school, I will stand in the door and prevent them from coming in. Well, 2 young ladies were coming to this building who happened to be black to register for classes, and he came. So did the United States military, representatives of the federal government, quite angry with him, of course. And he stood there for just a moment. Of course, it was symbolic.